Hello. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Awesome. Hello. So, welcome to, I think this is my sixth webinar. So today we are going to be talking about the Mediterranean diet, and I have a very special guest with me. As I always like to remind you, the webinars are all recorded, so if you would not like your webcam on or your speech on it, I would recommend you keep those off. You are welcome to ask questions throughout the presentation by either unmuting your microphone or typing something in the chat. We'll have both up here. And yeah, without further ado, we'll get started. So hopefully you remember me. I am Dana. I'm the registered dietitian for Stony Point Women's Health, and I have a very, very special guest with me today. The wonderful internist, Dr. Deborah Kane from Stony Point Women's Health, and also Holly Hart. So
thank you, Dana, for the invitation to join you.
Yay!
Yay! Yay! I'm trying to see if I can get so we could see our video here too. Well, actually, I'm going to turn our video off. So, okay. All right. So, with the Mediterranean diet, the things we're going to talk about today is, so Dr. Kane is going to go through some of the history of the Mediterranean diet. We're going to talk about the structure and the different components of the nutrition of the Mediterranean diet. We're going to summarize, as we like to do. We're actually going to talk about a few recipes that are related to the Mediterranean diet, as well as some additional resources for those who are interested in learning more. So, first we are going to talk about the history. So this is Dr. Kane's area of expertise.
So when we're talking about the Mediterranean diet, I wanted to start first by talking about the Blue Zones. Now, the Blue Zones was a project that was started by Dan Buettner, and he was a National Geographic journalist. And he designed this study about 15, 16 years ago. And he initially set out to identify places around the world where people lived the longest and healthiest, and to identify what were those characteristics of their lives that helped them to do so. And he was able to identify 5 locations throughout the world. One is here in the United States, Loma Linda, California. We have one in Costa Rica, one in Italy, one in Greece, and one in Japan. And it's in these areas that we started to see that individuals were living to greater than 100 years old while sustaining a high quality of life. So what did the Blue Zones project figure out? And so what they were able to identify is that even though each area of the world had some very unique aspects about them, they also had some things that were very common amongst each other. So even though Loma Linda had, this really complicated healthy social circle that supported healthy ways of living, in Japan, Okinawa had a lot of turmeric in their diet, and they had kind of a very leisurely way to their life. And in Italy, they had this locally made wine that was high polyphenols. Those were all kind of unique characteristics for each of those locations. But what they had in common was that they had a strong sense of family. They did not smoke. They had plant-based diets. They had moderate physical activity. So they weren't gym rats. They didn't, do weekend warrior stuff. This was everyday activity. They were getting up, moving around, taking care of their day-to-day life. And then social engagement. And then the other important aspect was legumes, beans and lentils in their diet. So some of the key aspects we talked about that they were able to identify that helped them to live longer. So in addition to having those plant-based diets, these people had a strong focus on family and a celebration of their elders. So they had multi-generational households where there was a lot of respect given to the elders, whether it was helping to take care of the kids in the family, whether it was helping with the gardening. And they also had a place in the community where they were looked at as a source of wisdom for them. And then in regards to the food in the Blue Zones, they didn't necessarily always look at it as food as fuel. They also looked at that food as a time for ritual, for time for cementing and bonding with their family, their friends, and their community. And in Sardinia, they actually had a phrase, and I apologize if I mispronounce this, but it's, they say "Acantanos," which means may you live to 100. So every night at dinner, they make that toast, may you live to 100. So some of these key practices that were identified in the blue zone was that they maintained that active lifestyle, they ate less than the average person, they had a really plant-heavy diet, that strong sense of community through family or faith, and a strong sense of purpose or plan. So with the blue zones, what they identified is that people could live a long and healthy life, and that aging did not necessarily have to coexist with chronic illness. And so what they also found in the blue zones is that individuals that had diets that were high in saturated fat, low in those fruits and vegetables, who had very sedentary or inactive lives, high stress, smoking, and obesity, those individuals aged but with disability and chronic illness. So the history of the Mediterranean diet, we're going to shift gears here, originated with Ancel Keys. And Ancel Keys was a physiologist in the 1950s. And what he did is he conducted a 7-country study. And what they were trying to do was identify what were the actual risk factors that were associated with early cardiovascular disease. So they had 16 different cohorts through these 7 countries. And I apologize, it was done in the 1950s, so only men were allowed in this study. They were aged 40 to 59. And beginning in 1958, they started to look at these cohorts about every 5 years. Now, the United States cohort was based with the railroad system, and we only actually have 1 cohort from the United States. So all of the longevity studies that they've been doing related to the 7-country studies are from these other nations. But their goal was to explore in detail what were the associations between activity and diet and the lifestyle features that might increase a person's risk for cardiovascular disease.
So with these different studies, there was some variation in the type of risk factors and information that they collected. So they had these initial cohorts, these 16 cohorts, where they were looking at a lot of very similar properties. So for example, cardiovascular outcomes, different clinical outcomes, things like that. But some of these cohorts kind of varied in the information they collected. So in the Netherlands cohort, the Zoekten study, they actually collected dietary recalls to further assess how the diet influences the different cardiovascular as well as kind of mortality outcomes. And then moving forward about 25 years later, they were looking back at some of these same cohorts for different types of information. So in what became known as the FIND study, which is Finland, Italy, Netherlands, elderly study, they were looking specifically at aging. So for example, ability to perform activities of daily living, different types of chronic illness. They did the same thing in the healthy aging longitudinal study. They also did another Zoekten study with specific dietary assessments done during this time to again get a better picture about how this initial cohort of people is aging throughout the next 40 years. Throughout these different studies, they did a lot of different mortality markers to see essentially the longevity of these people's lives that they originally started studying all the way back in 1958. So again, kind of this big overarching study that broke up into these tiny little cohorts that were able to collect a ton of different information regarding diet, lifestyle, as well as clinical outcomes. So aside from this study, there's plenty and plenty of research that has kind of evolved from the Mediterranean diet. So using some of the information that they gathered from this huge 7-country study, many other research institutions have developed studies evaluating the Mediterranean diet for health outcomes. So for example, there are roughly 1,400 studies looking at cardiovascular disease and citing this original Mediterranean diet study. All sorts of studies on the Mediterranean diet exist, ranging from its influence on obesity, cancer, Alzheimer's, as well as some more niche outcomes. For example, there is some research on depression and the Mediterranean diet. But the key to this is to realize that there was this initial surge of this fantastic research study, but so many other studies have been born using the outcomes that they found from here. So the reason that we really like to emphasize the Mediterranean diet, both in our clinic as well as kind of throughout some of our other presentations, is because we know there is such a strong body of research to support it.
So one of the outcomes that they identified in the Mediterranean 7-country study was the association of the cholesterol levels. So on your y-axis, the one that runs vertical, it gives you the level of the total mean serum cholesterol. And then the x-axis, or the horizontal one, is the relationship to all-cause death or cardiovascular deaths. And what we can see here is that early on, you see Japan with a mean serum cholesterol of 162, and you see Greece at a mean serum cholesterol of 207. So they had lower levels of mean serum cholesterol and lower levels of cardiovascular disease compared to when you shifted further to the right, and you can see the United States at 240 or Finland at 256 and 285. They had the highest rates of cardiovascular disease. And the reason why we focused on this today, this mean serum cholesterol, is because how we eat can modify this outcome measure. Oh yeah, and I forgot to mention that typically we like to keep that mean serum cholesterol less than 200. So you can see those populations that are able to keep that number less than 200 have that lower cardiovascular risk.
Awesome. So before we transition to talking more about the dietary component of the Mediterranean diet, does anybody have any questions on the history of either the blue zones or the Mediterranean diet?
No.
Okay. Awesome. All right, so then we will dive a little bit more into the eating pattern, which would go right in tune with our nutrition webinar. So with the Mediterranean diet, the research has showed that the people in these communities are eating some foods more often than others. So my favorite thing about the Mediterranean diet is that it's a diet based on frequency rather than specific food groups or restricting or eating a ton of certain things. So it's more about doing some things more often and doing other things less often. So thinking about this, the best depiction of this eating pattern is typically the pyramid. So some of us are familiar with the pyramid from the old dietary guidelines of the United States, but this is the one that they use when describing the Mediterranean diet. So as we can see, we're looking at a base of kind of positive physical activity, interactions with others, social engagement, and then we're working up into the foods that we should be really eating most often. So typically things like our fruits, our veggies, our whole grains, beans, legumes, nuts, and seeds. And we want to emphasize that these are the things that we really want to be eating every single day without any restrictions. As we move up the pyramid, we're looking at things that are to be consumed, but maybe not quite as frequently. So for example, things like our fish and seafood, we want to do often at least twice a week, but maybe not every single day, and working our way up towards things we want to do maybe only a few times a week or even once a month. So for example, sprinkling in our poultry, our eggs, our cheese, our yogurt moderately throughout the week, as well as decreasing our meats and sweets to about once month, and really trying to emphasize small portions. The Mediterranean diet also does include wine in moderation. So we'll talk a little bit more about what that means as well. So what I typically tell my patients is our goal is we're really aiming every day to fit in that base of that pyramid. So we're trying to get our fruits and veggies, our whole grains, our beans and legumes, and our nuts and seeds, and then we're trying to filter those other things in. And we'll talk about different goals that get us close to this eating pattern. So of note, the structure of the Mediterranean diet does not have to be cookie cutter. So a lot of times people ask, well, okay, I don't live in the Mediterranean, or I eat a vegetarian diet. So what we can do is we can fit this structure to fit our specific dietary needs and preferences. So for example, on the leftmost here, this is the Latin American diet pyramid, which again is still going to emphasize those same fruits, vegetables, but maybe would emphasize those fruits, vegetables, and whole grains that people of Latin descent would be more likely to consume. Additionally, moving upward, we're going to see the same thing. We're going to see that we're doing fish about twice a week, and really trying to moderate our intake of poultry and yogurts and cheeses, as well as really reduce our amount of meats and sweets up at the top. But again, very similar structure. With the vegetarian example, pretty similar. Base of fruits and veggies. When we're moving up, considering we're removing our meats and poultry and fish, we're emphasizing those vegetarian sources of protein. So things like our beans, nuts, legumes, and working our way up towards the things like the dairy or the sweets up here. So again, base of fruits, veggies, whole grains, working our way up towards the proteins, really trying to limit our animal products as well as our sweets. And to not be too redundant, very similar with the African heritage diet pyramid, always fruits and veggies, working our way up through our proteins to our moderated sweets, as well as our Asian diet pyramid. This one, I'd like to point out, is a little bit different in that the base is typically more products such as rice and noodles, but still working our way towards our fruits, veggies, up through our proteins to reducing our meats and sweets. So really what we are looking for is to build our own pyramid that emphasizes our maybe different preferences as well as our culture. All right, so before we move into the different components, any questions on the structure of the Mediterranean diet? You're all so quiet today. I usually have so many questions. Okay. Awesome. So the different components of the Mediterranean diet, we typically talk about 9 big components. So the first component is the one I love to talk about, which is our veggies. So important to notice, in other studies of the Mediterranean diet, they found that each additional serving of vegetables per day reduces your risk of cardiovascular disease by about 4%. So that's just every additional veggie. So with that, the serving sizes, we're typically looking at about 10.8 ounces per male and 8.9 ounces per female per day. That doesn't mean a lot to many of us. So what we're really looking at is about 6 or 7 servings per day. A serving of our vegetables is typically about a cup raw. So for example, thinking about our leafy greens, our spinach or collards, things that take up more space, versus a half of a cup of our cooked veggies. So thinking about our choices there. So are we going to do a nice big salad, or are we going to do maybe a half a cup of string beans? The way I encourage my patients to meet this goal of getting the 6 to 7 servings is to make sure you have a vegetable at every meal. In these webinars, we've talked a lot about the healthy plate, which includes half of that plate as those non-starchy vegetables. So if we're thinking about fitting maybe a nice big salad on that plate, or doing maybe 2 different veggies, a half a cup each, to make 2 servings, If we do that 3 times a day, we're getting our 6 servings because we would have 2 servings of vegetables per meal. Sometimes when people opt for maybe not doing a vegetable at breakfast, I will say, okay, where are we going to fit another serving in to aim for our 6 or 7? I always encourage my patients, we are trying to eat a variety of vegetables. We're not trying to do string beans 6 or 7 times a day. We're trying to eat the rainbow and get a bunch of different colors. All of our veggies are going to have vitamins and minerals, but they are going to have different profiles of those things. So we really want to mix them up. Also, when we're thinking of our veggies, so yes, potatoes are a vegetable, but unfortunately, they do not have quite the nutritional prowess as these other ones. So we want to limit our potatoes to about 1 serving per week. We do not want them to be the base of our vegetable intake. So our second component is our legumes. So our legumes are any really pod-like structure. So we're thinking about our lentils, peas, peanuts, beans. And the important thing to remember when we were thinking about our blue zone Venn diagram is our legumes were sitting right in that center. So they were a really critical part of these healthy diets. In some studies, they found that eating legumes 4 times a week reduced heart disease by about 22%. And that was in a study of over 10,000 men. So we know that these are really influential in protecting our heart. So serving sizes are averaging about 2.1 ounces a day for men, 1.75 ounces for women. So that is going to look like about a serving or 2 per day. Sometimes people would prefer to think about it more per week. So we're aiming for at least 4 to 5 times a week. Typically speaking, I do encourage my patients to try to get 1 of these things a day. And of note, our servings, we're typically looking about a half a cup of our cooked beans or lentils, or about 2 tablespoons of peanut butter. Adding these things in can be somewhat tricky, but is really easy if we're thinking of them as kind of a supplement. So for example, one thing I usually encourage people to do is if you're already doing something like a salad or maybe a soup that you already love, adding beans in there is usually pretty simple. With our beans, there's a variety of different types we can use. We can do our dry beans and cook them. We want to make sure that we rinse them thoroughly. And our canned beans as well are perfectly appropriate as long as we rinse them thoroughly. The reason that we like to either soak our dry beans or rinse our canned beans is it helps to reduce the gas that we get from these. So I know that's a big complaint. So we really want to make sure we're doing all we can in that department. I also encourage my patients to try a new type of bean. So for example, I hear all the time that people don't like beans. There's plenty out there. So there's chickpeas, white beans, there's kidney beans, black beans, always something new to try. So if you don't like one, try another. There's a lot of ways to squeeze these into our diet. And our third component is our fruit and nuts. So for our daily goals for this piece, we're looking at about 8.9 ounces per men and 7.7 ounces for women. This is going to look like 2 to 4 servings. So of note, per the Mediterranean guidelines, this is a little bit lower than typically recommended by something like the dietary guidelines. And it's important to remember fruit and nuts are put in the same category. So with these servings, we're looking at about 1 ounce of nuts, which is typically about a handful, or it's about the equivalent to 1/4 of a cup. A small fruit, so we're talking about our 4-ounce apple, a cup of berries, half a banana, or a cup of melon. So a lot of variety based on the type of foods that we are choosing. Adding these things in is usually not very difficult for a lot of people. So typically, I recommend people add nuts to things again like oatmeal and salads. So just kind of adding something additional on top. Also, for my people who are like salty snackers or kind of chewy snackers, I usually recommend swapping for like a lightly salted or an unsalted handful of nuts. And for my people who have a sweet tooth, eating fruit is perfectly appropriate. So with that, we'd be getting a little bit more fiber than from our traditional desserts. So we can, for example, do something like frozen grapes. I've had people love to snack on, or just doing, you know, a couple berries with some Greek yogurt, but thinking about how we can use that fruit as a sweet treat. Number 4 is our cereals and our whole grains. So this is a very varied portion, and we're typically looking at 10.4 ounces per men, 8.9 ounces per women, and again, a lot of variation in the serving sizes. We're typically looking for about 3 to 6 servings a day, where a serving is, for example, a slice of bread, a fourth cup of cooked cereal, such as oatmeal or quinoa, or I'm sorry, a half a cup of something like brown rice or pasta, or a half a cup of our starchy veggies. So for example, our potatoes, peas, and corn. For this portion, we want to think of that nice quarter of the plate. When we're thinking about getting a quarter of our plate as our carbohydrate, if we're trying to get our 3 to 6 servings per day, that looks like about 1 to 2 servings per meal. So maybe we have a nice half cup of brown rice with our dinner to get our serving in, or maybe we have a sandwich at lunch and we get our 2 servings in with our 2 slices of whole grain bread. So a lot of ways to fit these guys in here by fitting them into that quarter of a plate. Regarding ways to get these in, it's not that we often don't eat enough grains, is that sometimes we don't eat enough of the whole grains. So as a reminder, our whole grains are going to be our grains that are higher in fiber. So typically a lot of people remember them kind of as brown versus white. So when we're looking at things like our pastas or our breads, we always want to make sure that our first ingredient says whole wheat. The ingredients are always listed by weight, so we want our whole wheat to be our kind of biggest portion. If we are looking, for example, at a bread and it says something like enriched, fortified, bleached, unbleached, we're looking at a refined product. So we really want to be careful when we're thinking about what a whole grain really is. I always encourage people to try some new whole grains. If you do not like brown rice, maybe you will like quinoa. There are a lot of things out there, for example, barley, farro, a lot of different options. Maybe it's trying a new bread you like or a whole grain pasta you've never had before. One other one I like to talk about a lot is popcorn is a whole grain, right? It's the whole kernel of popcorn, of corn, sorry. So also a good substitute for some other of our refined grain snacks. Number 5, so this is the one that I think a lot of people think of when they think of the Mediterranean diet, and this is our fish. So our weekly goal for fish is about 2 4-ounce servings. So typically this is about the size of a checkbook, or if you were to open your palm, about the size of your palm, including your fingers. So with these 2 servings, there's a lot of different ways to get them in. There is a lot of questions I receive about mercury, and we really can do a little bit of our research and check to see what our low mercury options are using a resource such as seafoodwatch.org. But typically speaking, if we're choosing things like our salmon, our albacore tuna, we should be perfectly okay doing our 2 servings per week. I usually recommend for getting it in to make a swap. So for example, if you are a person that does a burger, you know, every Wednesday for lunch, maybe trying to do fish instead. Or I often recommend doing things like your canned tuna is just fine. So that's a product we would want to get packed in water, a low sodium version, but would be perfectly appropriate to get in our extra serving of fish per week.
Dana.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I thought on the earlier slide that you could do fish every day, but this is saying just twice a week, right?
Yeah, so you can do it more depending on the type of fish. So the big concern with the seafood is the mercury. So typically kind of 2 servings per day is making sure we are not exceeding that. So that would require a little bit of research, but typically we're really aiming for only that 2 servings a week.
Okay, thanks.
So even if you look, sorry, it's going to take me a minute to go back, on our pyramid, it's kind of crammed into that moderation portion. So as you can see, it's kind of up at the top where it says often at least 2 times a week, but not necessarily in this bottom portion where it's every day.
Okay, thanks.
No problem. Good question. All right, let me see if I can get back here. All right, awesome. Okay, and then number 6 is our fats and our oils. So in the Mediterranean diet, we're really emphasizing our unsaturated fats. So I always tell my patients our unsaturated fats are kind of loose, runny ones. So for example, when we're comparing the fat from an animal product like a steak, it's typically that like spongy fat that you have to kind of pull off something. Or when you think about cooking bacon and you can't pour the grease down your sink because it'll ruin your plumbing, we don't want that chunky fat. We want nice and runny, because that's what helps to keep our cholesterol down, because we're opting for those unsaturated fats rather than those saturated fats. So when we talk about our plant fats, we're typically talking about our plant fats that are high in those unsaturated oils, such as olive oil, canola oil, avocado oil. We want to be using those as often as possible. So some ways to do this, for example, is just if you're a person who likes to saute, making sure you're using olive oil, using something like an olive oil based dressing, or even swapping a margarine made with those nice plant oils for butter. Or even if you're doing something like bread, maybe instead of doing butter on the bread, doing something like olive oil. So a lot of different ways to get this in there. All right, and 7 is our dairy. So dairy is one that is hotly debated. So of note, the dairy that we're typically seeing in those blue countries, and those Mediterranean countries, is not often from milk. So from that liquid dairy, we're more often thinking about our cheeses and our yogurts. So our goals for this dairy portion are typically 7.2 ounces per men, 6.9 ounces per women, looking at about 1 to 2 servings per day, sometimes even doing less, like more like 4 to 5 servings a week. So with that, a serving is going to be something like a cup of milk, a kind of serving of yogurt, which is about 6 ounces, or an ounce of cheese. So again, if we were to cup our hand and fill it with shredded cheese, with these different products, we are going to be opting for our non-fat or low-fat versions to minimize our saturated fat in our diet. So in the Mediterranean countries, the 2 types of cheeses we're seeing the most are our feta and our mozzarella, because they are typically lower in saturated fat and sodium. And when we're thinking about adding yogurt to our diet, we really want to make sure we're not choosing ones with those extra added sugars. So we want to be thinking about how we can sweeten a plain yogurt with something like fruit, so we're not adding too much sugar in there. I always tell people too, trying something like a plant-based milk, if you haven't already, can be really helpful. Wouldn't exactly fit into this dairy category, but would help us add some of those healthy fats, or help us to maybe pull away if we're doing too much dairy in our diet. And number 8, so almost there, almost to our 9. Number 8 is our meats. So again, we're working our way towards that top of the pyramid. So this is something we're really, really trying to limit. So daily goals for men is about 3.9 ounces, females is about 3.3 ounces. So about either at 1 or none servings of a 3-ounce serving of meat per day. So 3 ounces of meat is typically about a deck of cards. Or if you're going to take a look at your palm, we are typically thinking about kind of this bottom portion of our hand. So this piece excluding our fingers. So with, sorry, I lost my mouse. Okay. All right, so with these true Mediterranean guidelines, we're typically only aiming for once a month for these things. So we really want to be thinking about our red meats as a treat. They are not something to be consumed every day or even necessarily every week. With this is always a really hard transition for a lot of people. So we talked in more detail about the benefits of cutting out some of our meat products last week during the Plant-Based Fundamentals webinar. But what's important to remember is that these meats can be a big source of saturated fat in our diet, as well as some more harmful things as well. So what I always tell people is start where you're at. If you are a person who maybe does red meat every day for lunch, maybe the goal next week is to only do it 3 days a week, and then work our way back towards that once a month. If you're a person who does it twice a week, maybe aiming for once a week next week. When we do these products, we still want to aim for trimmer portions, so lower fat, leaner cuts. So for example, for pork, looking at something like pork tenderloin, getting the trimmed chicken thighs, or lean ground beef, thinking about our 93.7. And then we really, really, really want to avoid our processed meats. So things like our hot dogs, bologna, lunch meat, pepperoni, sausage, bacon. These things are at minimum really high in sodium and unnecessary source of it in our diet, but also there's some interesting research to show increased incidence of things like colorectal cancer with consumption of these products. So we really, really want to reduce them in our diet. And alcohol. So this piece is one that I have become more recently acquainted with based on some research I have done. So the daily goals for the Mediterranean diet are alcohol in moderation. So for men, that is 2 drinks, and for females, that is 1 drink a day. These do not add up. This does not mean you get to save for women your 7 drinks and do it all on a Saturday night. We are aiming for just that nice moderated intake. And a drink we're typically considering to be about a 12-ounce beer, a 5-ounce serving of wine, or a 1.5 ounce of liquor. So thinking about like your standard shot glass. Important to note, if you are not currently doing alcohol in your diet, you do not need to add it. This is not a critical piece of the Mediterranean diet. They have seen intake of things like red wine in some of these populations have been helpful due to the polyphenols, which can help combat things like antioxidants, things like that, but totally not important to add if you do not already. That being said, there are certain populations who should absolutely not have this in their diet, or should really try to moderate. For example, individuals with heart failure, liver disease, of course, any alcoholism or addiction, as well as cancer is typically not recommended. Any questions on the 9 components?
Okay, thank you, Dana. You did an amazing job, as always. What I think is so powerful about the Mediterranean diet and eating pattern is that if we just improve 2 components of that eating pattern in our diet, we can decrease our mortality by 25%. And I think this is so powerful. We just don't spend enough time talking about nutrition as a way of preventing disease. Because if I put a patient who has high cholesterol on a statin, they have to be on that statin for 5 years in order for me to reduce that risk of cardiovascular risk by 21%. So if I can do that through diet and moving somebody just 2 steps closer to eating a Mediterranean pattern, why not? Why not do that? It's healthier, it's less expensive, and has a better outcome and a better quality of life.
So thinking about this in really simplistic terms and kind of process oriented, when we are moving to our Mediterranean diet, we are increasing our plants and our healthy oils, our olive oil specifically, which would increase our amount of antioxidants as well as decrease the cholesterol in our diet. Additionally, we're typically reducing, as we get closer to that top of the pyramid, our animal products, which would decrease both our oxidants as well as that saturated fat and cholesterol. So kind of multifactorial, both adding in things that are really, really good for us, as well as maybe reducing some of the things that can have less favorable outcomes. All right, so some main takeaways here is I always tell people this is a journey. So we do not have to do everything overnight. We just want to make simple changes. So I like this diagram the best because it's kind of, go slow and then go, go, go. So what we're looking at is we really want to start moving by making those little kind of component by component changes. So some examples that this diagram shows, for example, maybe a start is going through your pantry and maybe cleaning out or donating some of the foods that don't fit this pattern. Starting to do things like reducing our sweets, maybe only doing a dessert a few times a week, or doing red meat less often. Next step would be adding things in, right? So trying to add those veggies, add those legumes, add that olive oil. And maybe as you get more advanced, it might look like more lofty goals. So for example, maybe trying to eat vegetarian more often, maybe about 80% of the time. Or maybe you're swapping out your favorite snack for something like nuts or something like fruit. And as you've really advanced, maybe you are, trying to reduce your dairy even. So I always tell people we want to think about where we're at first, and then think of the smallest changes. And as we do those things and build our confidence, we can work on some things that might be a little bit more adventurous for us now.
So we pulled two recipes that are very straightforward and easy, and we can certainly be cooking in the COVID-19 pandemic pantries. And they incorporate some of those characteristics of the Mediterranean diet. So the first one is the roasted tomato and white bean stew. It is absolutely delicious, and I made this past weekend for my whole family. And so very easily, preheat your oven to 425 degrees, and in a large baking dish, toss those tomatoes with some olive oil and thyme. You can season with salt and pepper. Remember to watch how much of that salt that you're going to be adding to it. And then we roast those tomatoes until they've collapsed. Now, in my refrigerator, I had 1 container of cherry tomatoes, and then I had just some regular tomatoes also. And so I cut up my bigger tomatoes, so they were about the same size as my cherry tomatoes, and I roasted those all together. So if you don't happen to have cherry tomatoes, you can use any kind of tomatoes you have. Just make sure that they're all about the same size when you're preparing them, so they'll cook at the same rate. So while those are roasting in a small bowl, go on ahead and make sure you're washing your parsley, your fresh parsley, because it can get a lot of dirt and grind on it. So I always rinse it in a bowl, pull it out, dump it out, and wash it about 3 times. And then the lemon zest. A lemon zest is where you just kind of use your shredder and you're just taking off the yellow part of the lemon. You don't want to get the white part because that's kind of bitter. You just want to keep that yellow part. And so you toss that parsley and lemon zest together and just let it sit. So, and then you're going to move over to your stovetop and you're going to dice your onions and garlic and you're going to saute them into a pot. You're going to add some red pepper flakes. Depending upon how spicy you like it, you can add more or less. And then once you start to smell the onions and the garlic and the onion has turned from that white to translucent, you're going to go ahead and add in your 2 cans of rinsed white beans, and you're going to add in your broth, about 1.5 cups. At this point, once I've added my broth in, I took my potato masher and I mashed up half of my white beans in that soup. And once my roasted tomatoes were done, I put those in, simmered it for 5 or 10 minutes, ladled it into an individual bowl, and I topped it with that parsley and lemon zest. It was delicious. And everybody in my family ate that, from my 14-year-old until our 50-year-old. So it was a great dish.
Awesome. And we do have a question about Mediterranean breakfasts. So definitely a question that I get a lot because breakfast, we're used to eating very different foods than we are for lunch and dinner. So typically the American breakfast is going to involve less of those, veggies, less of those whole grains. So what are some good swap outs? Do you want to share some?
Yeah, so a really simple breakfast that abides by that Mediterranean eating pattern is using a piece of whole grain bread. So you're getting your whole grain, and then actually your natural peanut butter, because peanuts are a legume. And so you've already added in your legume for the day, just simply with using whole grain bread and that natural peanut butter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. One that I see a lot of patients do as well is doing a omelet or something with the different veggies kind of mixed in there to get those servings of vegetables in pretty early. As well as, again, doing something like the whole grain bread, perhaps with something like avocado, maybe tomatoes on there, and if you wanted to add a little bit more protein, something like eggs or beans as well. So we really just want to be thinking about the base of that pyramid and designing this meal and how we can do more whole grains, how we can do more of our fruits and our veggies. It's a great question.
And so the second recipe that I pulled for everybody today is the quick lentil soup. It's a one-pot meal, and I was inspired to include this because last week it was kind of cold and rainy, and so I wanted something warm to eat. But here again, the quick lentil soup incorporates our vegetables. It incorporates our legumes, which is our lentils in there, and with very simple seasoning. So in your one pot, you're going to use your olive oil and you're going to saute your carrots, your celery, and your onion. And then you're going to add your water, your broth, your lentils, your garlic, and your thyme. And you're going to cook that for about 20 minutes. So it's a pretty fast meal and it's easy to do at the end of a workday, not very taxing on the chopping. And then in the very last minute, right before you're going to serve this meal, you're going to add in that balsamic vinegar, and it just makes that meal sparkle. And if you have kale around, I often will add in that bunch of kale in that last few minutes of making the soup so that it stays bright and green. If you put it in too early, then it gets brown and wilted. So this is another quick recipe that you could consider adding into your weekly regimen.
Awesome, thank you. All right, and then finally, we have some of our additional resources. So we went through a bunch of different structures as well as things to kind of work on today, as well as recipes, of course, which I will be sending out more information on probably early next week or today. But some additional resources that we use a lot in our clinic, as well as even in our personal lives. The first one is oldwayspt.org. So this is a fantastic resource on specifically the Mediterranean diet, but healthy eating overall. They have tons of handouts on there. They have a lot of different recipes. So certainly my go-to when trying to educate patients about the Mediterranean diet. Bluezones.com talks a lot more about that history piece that we talked about today, but they also have, little tips and tricks on there. They have recipes. They have different challenges, so worth taking a look as well when we're thinking about, making our lifestyle a little bit more Blue Zone. And then the 7countrystudy.com. So if you're looking for more information on the research of how this is kind of all evolved and why we make the recommendations we do, this is a really kind of patient-friendly resource, so I would certainly recommend it. All right, so that sums up our talk. So I'm going to turn our camera back on. Does anybody have any questions? Well, I will give you some time to ask, but thank you again so much for coming. If anybody has to kind of scoot out of here. And I want to say thank you so much to Dr. Kane for helping me with this webinar. It's very exciting to be able to do one with her.
Thank you for letting me come.
Yes, anytime.
Thank you, Dr. Kane.
You were so very
Miss you.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, absolutely. So can I talk more about popcorn as a snack? Absolutely. So typically when we're thinking about a snack size of popcorn, we're looking at about 3 cups. So the reason I recommend this as a snack, it's a pretty big volume. A lot of different ways to play with it. So what I typically recommend is we're not trying to do this and then add a ton of salt on top of it so that it's really no different than something like our chips. So for example, a lot of times people pop it over the stove. You can do like cinnamon if you're looking for that kind of more sweet taste. I've had patients do even like curry powder, things like that. I have done nutritional yeast, which is great to add some, extra nutrients in there. But we're typically looking at about 3 cups.
Does everybody know how to make their homemade popcorn? Because this is really a lovely snack to incorporate in through the week. Basically, you're just taking a tablespoon or 2 teaspoons of that olive oil, put that into your pot on your stovetop, 3 kernels, put the lid on it, shake, 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 shake. When you hear those 3 kernels pop, then you're going to put in a 4th cup of your kernels, put the lid back on, shake, 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 shake. And when you stop hearing the popping, your popcorn is done. And this way you're not getting exposed to all the chemicals that come with the microwave popcorn. And what you'll notice is that when you're doing it on the stovetop, is that all of your kernels will pop. A lot of times when you're using that microwave popcorn, so much doesn't get popped and half of your popcorn didn't even come out. But if you do it right on the stovetop, it's fantastic. And get creative with those spices in your drawer and season them in all different sorts of ways. The nutritional yeast that Dana suggested gives it a little bit more of a cheesy, nutty flavor. So that's kind of fun to do. Some people will do wheat germ also with on top of their popcorn. Lots of different ideas.
Repeat ingredients for stovetop.
So stovetop is about 2 teaspoons of olive oil and a 1/4 cup of popcorn.
When a person has a respiratory virus, are there changes to the Mediterranean diet you recommend? No. Just keep doing the same things. No changes there. And then if you were limiting your dairy, where else can you get your calcium from? So that's a really good question. So calcium is actually in a lot of plants. So it's, for example, in a lot of our leafy greens when we're thinking about our spinaches, things like that, as well as some of our kind of dairy alternatives are fortified as well. So thinking about, for example, our fortified soy milks, a lot of times, even sometimes like tofu will be fortified with calcium. So certainly if you were doing your kind of variety of vegetables, it's very possible to get enough calcium without putting the dairy in your diet.
And then Dana, what did you say you can also get your calcium from your beans and your legumes and some in your nuts?
Yes, definitely. Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and turn the recording off, but